Introduction to the Module and Learning Objectives. Hi, I'm Dan Kranzler, and today this module is focusing on thinking like an investor. Think about your startup and ask yourself this question. If I were an investor, would I invest in this business? Now, before you answer that question, think about that question carefully. I want you to focus on the phrase, if I were an investor, would I think about this business differently? This module is really important in that it will unpack a set of very important elements of how an investor looks at, analyzes, invests in, and expects a return from a venture-backed startup. It'll first help you understand the difference between the way investors and entrepreneurs think. Next, it'll help you think about various questions that an investor would ask you about your business. And by understanding and thinking like an investor, you'll be able to communicate effectively with your investors about your business. Most importantly, it'll help you think about your own business differently. I've been an entrepreneur and an investor for over 55 years. I've started several businesses, from small 3-person startups to global businesses with thousands of employees. I've dealt with dozens of investors in my businesses, and subsequently, I've been an investor in over 200 startups. And I've had some wonderful insight, some helpful insight from investors, and some not. For much of my career as an entrepreneur, I thought investors were a necessary evil. I couldn't live without them. I couldn't live with them. If I could go back and share one thing with my younger self, not that I would have listened, it would be to think like my investors. It turns out investors think a certain way because they have experience and see things from a different perspective that I did not understand. The more I could think like an investor, the more successful my business would have been. The more of them I would have owned in terms of equity value, in terms of ownership, in terms of what I would have received. My businesses wouldn't have changed, but my perspective, my focus, timing, processes, what I would have done in what order, it would have changed and would have made a difference. Investors bring a deep wisdom being a combination of experience and time. They've seen hundreds of companies, even though they may not have run one. Again, it's about perspective. Some say it's like seeing the forest from the trees. Or there's a story you might have heard about of the blind men who met an elephant. Depending on the story, as I've heard it, there could be 4, 5, or 6 blind men in the story, but they each touched the elephant from a different perspective. Each end up with a completely different idea of what an elephant was, based on what part of the elephant they were touching. One guy says, this is a massive wall, because they were touching the side of the elephant. Another says, no, this is a pillar, because they were grabbing the leg. The person grabbing the trunk said, oh, this is a snake. The one grabbing the tusk would say, oh, this is a pointed spear, or the tail as a rope. It took a sighted man from some distance to put all the elements together to explain what an elephant really was. When you're riding the elephant, it looks quite different from that standpoint compared to standing in front of it or beside it, although hopefully not under it. You can't fully guide it without seeing all of the angles. In my experience, I began to understand investors so I could get them to put money into my companies. Then I began to work my company process to include investor experience and investor perspective. I looked at their issues and their processes to accommodate investors who trusted me with their money. I was surprised to discover how it changed how I ran my business. This is why at Venture Basecamp, we try to share with you, beginning in Entrepreneurship 101 and in other modules, our passion about the concept of thinking like an investor. It will completely and fundamentally shift the way you think about your own business, both strategically and tactically. Remember, the most important investor in your business is you. As the entrepreneur, you're the founder and the largest investor in your own business, You're investing your time and your career and your savings, maybe relatives' money, most likely a reduced income during your startup phase. You're investing your reputation and your talent, your focus. You're putting yourself into that business. That's the most valuable asset you have, worth far more than the money I put in. Thinking like an investor is more than theoretical. It's absolutely essential to give you the right mindset and understanding of how to build your business. If we can get you to really switch your hat from an entrepreneur's perspective to an investor's, this dual perspective will help you better develop and implement your vision, your mission, your priorities, and your outcomes. It's been one of the most profound shifts and benefits that entrepreneurs have indicated that they experienced over my decades of mentoring. As an entrepreneur, your key motive is to grow your business. To attain this objective, a key component is funding. And the key player in this equation is the investor. To attain funding from an investor, startups go through a long and extensive review process to convince an investor that their idea and startup is not just a fantasy, but it's an executable vision, something that's real and practical. Here's one of the hardest facts about building a venture-backed startup. You'll never have enough time and funds to do all the things you want to do and sometimes need to do in the time you've got allocated. Great entrepreneurship is about multitasking, triaging, assigning a degree of urgency to the things that you do, shifting priorities, putting out fires, and hopefully still doing the things that are important while tackling the things that are always urgent. Thinking like an investor will really help you here. This will become clear as we talk about answering questions that investors ask. Investors want to know about your product or service and your customer, your team, the market segments, finances, risks, all those components that are critical to a startup. Makes sense. When investors first asked me about all these things, I gave them what I thought was a really good, well thought out set of answers. But they were from my perspective as a founding entrepreneur. I gave them the perspective from the team who were developing the product, working to sell it, and generating revenue from it. It seemed to make sense at the time. But those investors kept asking me more and more questions. And me being impatient, I kept giving them answers. The more they asked, the more I went into detail about the product and the technology and the features, the sales process, and all the things my executive team was thinking about every day. But they weren't satisfied. Finally, a kind gentleman from one of my investment funds told me, "Daniel, you're not listening to the questions." "What do you mean? You asked me how I make money and return on your investment. I told you about the revenue we got and how we got customers and how we put them on and how we made money. No?" "No," he said. "That is how you make revenue and how you sell your product. It's not how you make money and return my investment. You return my investment by taking my funds and investing them and delivering a substantial return to my capital." You can imagine my puzzled look. "Bear with me," he said. "You take capital and you invest it in technology, in a team, in buying customers. You generate revenue from those customers that pays back that investment, first in the cost of your product, then in the cost of acquiring your customers, and then the overhead of your business, right? At that point, the customer has value. The stock I purchased with my investment in you is valued based on the cumulative net value of your customer." I wasn't really grasping what he was getting at yet. Then he went on to say something that really threw me. He said, "I don't really care how you get your customers or how you run the details of your business. I care about the return on investment you provide to me. How are you going to give me back at least $10 for every dollar I give you? And how might I actually get back $100? All the rest of my questions are just to get an idea of how you think I'm investing in you. I want to know if you're capable of giving me a return on my investment. If you think like I do, you would have been thinking about all the answers to the questions I've been asking from an investor's viewpoint. They're building components of building equity value. You'd be looking at that return on investment in everything. What's your return on investment in the way you market and sell your product? Is there a better way that could yield a better return? What's the return on investment in adding the next 100 features your engineers want to add to the product? What's your return on investment in billing, in customer support, in your team? When you can show me that you're thinking all of that, that you recognize that you are an investor in your own company and everything that you do, and you're thinking about every dollar you spend as an investor, I will be happy to invest in you. Well, I did, and he did, and we've been friends ever since. This was a really hard thing for me to do and caused more than a little bit of pain in the process. It took me multiple companies and multiple investments to fully grasp the depth of importance of these comments. Luckily, I've had some very successful businesses, and I've made a return that allows me to be able to be here and share these ideas with you. There was a lot of luck involved, but there was also a lot of thought and adjustment that was formulated from an investor's perspective. It did me well throughout my career. At one point, I literally had a hat made with 2 different shades or bills. One said entrepreneur, and one said investor. I would literally put the hat on in meetings with my team, with one bill facing forward. It's funny how a simple thing like that had a really important impact. So let's talk about how you answer questions from an investor's point of view. Okay, let's put on that hat. One who's making investment decisions based on facts and numbers, looking at patterns across technologies, people and markets, that's the investor. One who uses sector and market knowledge to put their numbers into perspective, and who avoids emotions from driving investment decisions. We're going to switch hats back and forth. Think of yourself as donning a 2-sided hat, one side reading entrepreneur and the other investor. This will help make thinking like an investor second nature to you. As an investor, I can tell you that when entrepreneurs go through this exercise, universally, they begin to think about all aspects of their business differently. And it'll be beneficial for both you and the investor as you gain this perspective before approaching an investor for funding. In addition to the insights I just mentioned, it will allow you to align your thinking with that of your investor. If you think like them, they'll love it, and you'll know how to speak specifically to them and what they're looking for, present to them, and address all those said and unsaid questions that they have about your business. It'll get you funded.